Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our second event this year. It's a roundtable discussion on one of our newest colleagues on campus, Michael Weinman, who is the co-author of a book that we'll be discussing today. The book is co-authored with Boris Vormann. It's entitled The Emergence of Liberalism, Understanding of a Global Phenomenon. We will have also a respondent today, and then we'll continue with the conversation. Michael is visiting assistant professor of comparative literature at IU, and is still officially a professor of philosophy at Bard College of Berlin, previously known as the European College of Liberal Arts, where he's on leave from 2020 to 22. Michael is the author and editor of several books, most recently the one that we will be discussing today, The Emergence of Liberalism, published by Routledge. His other recent work includes Plato and the Moving Image, a volume that he co-edited with Shai Biderman, and The Parthenon and Liberal Education, published by SUNY in 2018. Michael is interested in a variety of topics from Greek culture, political philosophy, and the intersection between the two. It's great to have him on campus. We will have a respondent by Simon Liu, who is a doctor candidate in the Department of Political Science. Simon has kindly agreed to give a 10-minute response, and after that we will be opening up for conversation. I would like to ask, since I'll be the moderator, I would like to ask that you identify yourselves when you ask questions, and you raise your hand by using the reaction button on the bottom of the screen, and I will take a note and I will invite you to speak. It would be a good idea to mute ourselves during the conversations to prevent background noises. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome Michael, who will be speaking first. Welcome, Michael, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. But please, you don't mute, because the birds are such a lovely background. I'll begin. I don't have any slides or anything formal to share. I have 5 numbered points, and this would be point 0 before them. And point 0 is, first of all, to thank you, Aurelian, and to thank Simon and Allison, and those are the people I know by name to thank for helping to make this happen, bring us all together in Zoom, and to thank each of you, some of whom are known to me and most of whom are not, for giving up some of your time and coming into this virtual space when in fact it is such a lovely day to speak together with me and one another about this labor of love, this book, The Emergence of Illiberalism, Understanding a Global Phenomenon. And the rest of point 0 is just a few comments on the title itself. So presuming no former knowledge of the book or its contents, but knowing that maybe at least some of us have read the introduction that was shared, I'll just say a few things about what you can learn about the volume from its title. And in chiefly the 3 maybe most disclosive words in the title, illiberalism, emergence, and global. And I think some of the things I want to say about these words are going to be controversial or interesting with respect to Simon's remarks that I just saw. So with that in the back of my mind, I just wanted to share at a most basic level for those who know nothing of the book, that we want to comment on the debate around the term illiberal democracy, which is a term that's been part of theoretical or conceptual analytic discourse, comparative politics, maybe since the end of the 1990s, maybe principally because of a famous foreign policy article by Fareed Zakaria using the term. And then of course, also part of political practice, especially the political practice of a very successful European politician, Viktor Orban, who's used the term more than once, and in particular in 2 speeches that have garnered a lot of attention and are discussed at some length in 4 of the chapters of the book. 2 of the chapters give a really substantial analysis to Orban's use of the term, and then sort of cycling back into theory world, a controversy to which one participant here today, who's gone off camera, made a significant contribution in response to Jan Werner Müller. There he is. Yeah, so a debate that happened in a few sites, in person, live, when that was still possible, and then in print, about whether or not the term illiberal democracy has conceptual clarity at all, whether we should use it, what are the analytic and the strategic and the normative, those 3 intersect, but maybe are distinguishable as categories. What are the implications in those respects of even using the term? So we hosted a conference, Boris Vormann, my co-editor, and Eva Atanasov, another colleague at Bard College Berlin of mine, who is a chapter author in the volume, in April of 2018, regarding illiberal democracy with a question mark at the end. And this volume, in a sense, is an outgrowth of that. A number of the contributions from that workshop have shown up. And then a number have been added since. And the title of the work is not Illiberal Democracy or the Emergence of Illiberal Democracy, I suppose, because what we want to stress is that illiberalism is definitely a thing that has emerged. It's it's a thing both in an abstract sense and in a concrete sense. There is a phenomenon. And there is a conceptual category, illiberalism. So it's both, so illiberalism, if you like, in scare quotes or inverted commas, as the British would say, and not. That's the subject of the book, so the emergence of illiberalism. So we have a number of different views among the chapter authors about what illiberalism is and how and why it has emerged. But I guess, yeah, the first distinctive thing to say about the volume is that it asserts that, or it understands that there is such a thing, and then it tries to understand it. And then the last thing, still under point 0, global phenomenon. So we didn't quite maybe reach the aspiration of the title in the finished product, in part because we lost a couple of chapters along the way, as might happen. But nevertheless, the idea is that if we agree or can agree that illiberalism is a phenomenon as well as a conceptual category, and if we can agree that it has emerged and we want to understand it now, I mean, what the volume as a whole is trying to say is that in order to do so, we have to have a global perspective. And what we mean by that is one cannot only attend to the autocratic tendencies of democratically elected leaders within the democratic world as it's traditionally understood. So that illiberalism, I mean, another reason to kind of undo the pairing of illiberalism and democracy in the category illiberal democracy is to understand contemporary illiberalism as its own thing. And that means also attending to mixed cases. So in this case, in the volume, in addition to chapters on North America and the United States and Canada and the UK and Western Europe, broadly speaking, chapter 7, and chapters on Central and Eastern Europe. As one might expect, there are also chapters on Brazil, on India, on Japan, and on Turkey. And yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Okay, so so much for what's generally going on. Maybe this will then be point 105 beyond that general introduction to what's going on in the book. It has 2 parts. The first part aims to provide a conceptual and historical analysis of what illiberalism means. And the second part that looks at these empirical manifestations. When you put the 2 parts together, There will be two key findings of the work as a whole I would want to argue, and this should resonate with the introduction for those who have read it, but what I wanted to pull out is these two conclusions. One, that the current crises of liberal democracy are the result of a series of tensions internal to the intersection of democracy, understood as some combination of popular sovereignty, modern democracy, I should stress, thinking of Eva in particular, that modern democracy, which we often drop, whatever that is, or democracy since the 18th century, popular sovereignty, national sovereignty, and majority rule, and liberalism, understood as individual rights, the protection of minorities on the one hand, and internationalism on the other hand. So liberalism as something input as a conceptual category, a crucial one of political theory, but also of global politics, international relations. And the second conclusion, first conclusion, that the current crises of liberal democracy are the result of tensions internal to the intersection of democracy and liberalism, and not primarily exogenous external factors. And then secondly, that there are principally three such internal tensions. One, the unmooring of economic liberalism from political liberalism, especially after 1945, and especially after the Reagan-Thatcher revolution against the welfare state. Two, the increasing irresponsiveness of governments and unelected policymaking bodies to national electorates. And three, the growing incapacity of any narrative of national belonging or civic identity to speak to the citizens, which is to say the electorates of nationally defined liberal democracies. And this is true whether we're speaking of so-called established or so-called emerging democracies. So to put it in one word, these three sources of tension between democracy and liberalism, we could call economic in the first case, institutional in the second case, and cultural in the third case. Some chapters, this is numbered point 3, some chapters in the volume focus on just one of these three roots. And for those who have an interest in the volume, I would point to Christian Lamott's chapter, The US in Perspective, or Jonathan Hopkin and Mark Blythe's chapter, Global Trumpism. And some focus more or less just on the second, on the institutional. So Claudia Wiesna's The EU and Its Chances for Democratic Revitalization, that's chapter 9. Or Roger Berkowitz, The Failing Technocratic Prejudice and the Challenge to Liberal Democracy, that's chapter 6. These place the stress on the institutional dimension. And then on the third hand, thinking about the cultural, I might point to Mark Plattner's Illiberal Democracy and the Struggle on the Right, chapter 3, and maybe most especially a contribution near and dear to my heart in the volume, which might surprise people who know me well, the contribution by the late Roger Scruton called The Open Society from a Conservative Perspective. So these, there are some chapters that really delve in depth into one of the three internal sources of tension, while other chapters, and here I would point to my colleague Eva Atanasov's chapter, Illiberal Democracy, a Tocquevillian Perspective, and our concluding epilogue, as we thought of it, Craig Calhoun's Populism and Democracy, a Long View, that really try to address all three. But whether an individual chapter is addressing just one, or perhaps two, or all three of the economic, institutional, and cultural sources of tension, what our hope is, with our introduction and the volume as a whole, that we need to see all three together. That even if we can analytically separate them, and if in some cases one or the other is more active when it comes to the empirical analysis of part 2 of the book, if we really want to understand the emergence of illiberalism, we have to see these together. Okay, so much about the book as a whole. I just have a couple of quick concluding points. Numbered point 4 would just be to say something that's not immediately apparent from the table of contents or the title of the book, or even if we go further into it and read the chapters, that I wanted to stress today is that one main goal of the volume that is, I think, relevant to our conversation today and the group that we've assembled here is to embody a kind of cooperation across continents and across disciplines that tries to understand a central tension within modern democracy by layering together insights that maybe aren't always thought together. So insights that come from comparative politics, that come from area studies and international relations, also from the history of political thought and classical political thought in particular, as well as historical, political, and cultural sociology and political theory. So not only a range of disciplines, if you go through that list of 15 contributors, we had in mind definitely disciplinary diversity, but also diversity in our national origins and in our places of work. So that we're not, we're studying from inside and outside in a kind of back and forth tension, and not presupposing or essentializing certain kinds of difference in the spirit of diversifying, which is hugely important, I would say, political theory in particular. And then maybe the fifth and closing point that I just wanted to bring out for the sake of our conversation is that who we are, I think, definitely means an awful lot for that project. And so Ira Cass-Nelson, who wrote one of the two reviews of the book that gets printed on the back cover, said something super kind about it, I found, that I do not purport to necessarily be the absolute truth, but to which I certainly aspire in intention, which is that the volume is an act of guardianship. So we make no bones of the fact that while trying to present as clear and demonstrable and empirical case, and to make descriptive claims that can be defended in their truth value, it's also definitely a work with a normative intent. And so it's relevant, for that, for that purpose, that we as the co-editors and the authors of the volume come from our individual subject positions, and that we work on the issues that we work on, bringing, to the extent that we can manifest it among ourselves, a truly global perspective, not only in terms of the nations analyzed in part 2, where we have our comparative case studies, but also in terms of the places where we are citizens, in fact, and those where we work, which are often not the same. So as that wouldn't necessarily be immediately apparent, and we needn't talk about that at any length today, but that's something that's important to me about the book as a document that seems to have an interesting reverberation among us as a group here today. So that was the last thing I wanted to point to in my opening remarks.
Thank you, Michael. The floor is now Simon's, and then I would like to remind you that we will go by raised hands, so please feel free to raise your hand, identify yourself, and then I will invite you to speak. Simon.
Thank you, Aurelian. Thank you, Michael. The Emergence of Illiberalism is a thoughtfully edited volume that is highly relevant to both developments in the academia and real politics, especially when the upcoming presidential election is less than a month away from us. It deals with various aspects related to the emergence of populist politics in liberal democracies across the world in recent years, including the conceptual delimitation of illiberal democracy, socio-economic roots of populist emergence, the unfolding of right-wing populist politics in different countries, and various answers to the what is to be done question. Includes diagnosis and prescriptions offered by scholars from diverse positions in the political spectrum. In this sense, the emergence of illiberalism is itself a contested discourse responding to the most troubling problem for defenders of liberal democracy today. Now, because of its nature as a contested edited volume, in my comments here, I attempt to ask a few open-ended questions for further discussion in the Q&A session. As Michael just pointed out, many contributors in this volume share a basic understanding that the current wave of illiberal populist politics is a result of the development of global financial neoliberalism since the 1970s, whose features include a depoliticized version of liberalism, unduly expansion of the market, reduction in social welfare, governmental irresponsiveness, and deterioration of social solidarity and trust. This is most clearly outlined in chapters 2 and 7. If so, then what has been undermined in the past several decades in established liberal democracies is democratic equality, or conditions conducive to democracy. Now the effects of democratic deterioration reveal themselves in driving populist leaders cracking down on liberal values, or let's say Enlightenment values in general. This is also why in chapter 1, Michael pointed out that undemocratic or purely economic liberalism is perhaps a better term to describe the current crisis. If this diagnosis is true, what is under siege today is both liberalism and democracy. Now, in terms of liberalism, it is argued, as Michael does in the preface, that a political liberal tradition represented by Smith, Mill, and Tocqueville could be the solution here. It is believed that this tradition has the potential to counter the depoliticizing tendency of economic neoliberalism and to revitalize a liberal politics geared towards defending the openness and plurality of society. How about democracy? Some of these thinkers don't have remarkable interests in democratic questions, such as Smith, even though he does care about broad questions about social justice. Some defend particular versions of democracy, for example, Mill's defense of representative democracy. Their liberalisms do not necessarily sit easily with democratic pursuits in our age. That, of course, doesn't mean they should be considered anti-democratic today. That's not true. But to revitalize a liberal tradition in the double crisis of liberalism and the democracy, we might want to consider how this tradition interact with the other side of this story. For instance, what kind of democracy is compatible or incompatible with political liberalism? Are these compatible versions sufficient to deal with the crisis of democracy today? If not, how can a compromise be made? In a context where liberal democracy under siege is taken as a pressing problematic, I think it will be very helpful to read and think about this volume in a way that stimulates discussions about these questions. And this is my first set of questions. Now, some contributors in this volume do take up this question and inquire the democratic part of the story. For instance, chapter 9 discusses democratic deficiencies in the EU and possible ways to deal with them. Others do talk about enhancing social trust and, more importantly, trust in liberal institutions. Democracy has institutional aspects, but it also has important and irreducible extra-institutional elements. These extra-institutional elements sometimes set up landscape of institutional establishment and change. Usually, they are intertwined with the less desirable elements of populist politics, as Craig Cajon alludes to in the final chapter, chapter 15. They don't always, these extra institutional elements, they don't always present themselves as defenders of liberal democracy. Instead, they sometimes look threatening to defenders of both liberalism and democracy. But one of the most important features of democracy, as many political thinkers have pointed out, is that democracy is about change. And the power of change is in the hands of those living in the present. In other words, democracy is the continual presence of the possibility of democratization. Are we ready to confront these extra institutional possibilities, even though sometimes they are buried in deep anti-system sentiments and disguised as enemies? This means that some approaches to address democratic deficiencies could probably be framed in another way. when we ask how institutions can be reformed to salvage liberty and the demos, we might also want to inquire the relationship between liberty, democracy, and institutions. For example, sometimes for the purpose of measurability, democracy has to be defined as a set of institutional features and scores, as reflected in some empirical chapters in this volume. How does that shape our understanding of democracy? How does this measurably institutional conception of democracy interact with the elitist or technocratic fallacy that has been identified by chapters 5, 6, 7, 15, and others? This is the second set of my questions. My last point concerns the word global in the subtitle of this volume. It is said that the emergence of illiberalism is a global phenomenon. I agree completely. It seems that we all agree that this crisis of liberal democracy is not just a dilemma for some countries. We are considering it a world historical event. Handled properly or not, it will have deep transforming impacts on our world. In many discussions about illiberal democracy, the following words and phrases frequently appear: salvage, defend, guard, the fate of liberal democracy, the future of the liberal world. As a person standing in between the Chinese and the American public spheres, I see a difference when I look at the Chinese side. I see many Chinese discussions worrying about the possibility of a new Cold War and the destructive impacts it can bring to the world. I see some, but that's discussions of this kind in conversations about illiberal democracy in the American or in the Western public sphere. I highlight the difference here because scholars of various political stances have similarly argued that the decline in social trust and communal solidarity is the main cause of this wave of rising populism, as pointed out by renowned conservative philosopher Roger Scruton in Chapter 5. Many also believe that for liberal democracy to survive the challenge of illiberal democracy or undemocratic liberalism, it is necessary to rebuild this communal solidarity. The result often points to something generally associated with liberal nationalism, an ideal that has been deeply studied and heavily debated since the late 1980s and early 1990s. If we are truly to think of this task of defending liberal democracy as a global task, we might want to situate this project of liberal nationalism in the context of an emerging new Cold War. After all, the rebuilding of communal solidarity, and very often national solidarity in our context today, involves drawing boundaries. If a new Cold War is looming large, drawing boundaries and revitalizing honor and solidarity might be easier because it is easier to identify an external enemy. But I'm sure that many of us will be suspicious of this easiness because we have learned from the last Cold War and this wave of populism that enemies of liberal democracy are not just out there in some non-liberal democratic countries. And national solidarity in the context of Cold War can be at least double-edged, for defending liberal democracy. If some version of liberal nationalism is indeed the way to go, how do we seek help from nationalist sentiments without demonizing the perceived external enemies of liberal democracy, without shifting attention from the internal diseases of liberal democracy? How can this healthy national identity be conceptualized? Is a global ideological war necessary and inevitable, or is there an alternative? This is the last set of my questions, and this concludes my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you both for two provocative and substantial contributions. The floor is open. I'd like to remind you that it would be best if we have 29 guests and it would be easier to identify yourself when you speak and also raise your hand so I can proceed in an orderly fashion. So the floor is open and the conversation can start. Who wants to begin? I have no, okay, so Dan first. make sure to unmute yourself.
Two comments arising from the presentation and the commentary, and one question. First, with respect to sort of the, I guess, the cultural aspect of this tension. You know, the U.S. and the point about communal solidarity that Scruton made. The U.S. has never had communal solidarity since the end of the Revolutionary War, has it? I mean, maybe for a brief period during the Second World War, but even then only because the war was overshadowing other issues in the United States. So it's not obvious to me that we've seen some you know, significant reduction in some mythic communal solidarity that might never have existed in the first place. Second point is about Scruton himself participating in explaining the erosion of liberal democracy, which he has attempted to facilitate in most of his work during his career. I just found that point interesting. I'd like to hear more about that. And then a third question, which is really sort of an empirical question designed to get at what it is precisely we're talking about. So taking Brexit on its own, is Brexit a manifestation of well-functioning liberal democracy, or is it a manifestation of the emergence of illiberal democracy? That's it.
Okay, Michael.
Thanks, Dan, for the questions. And thanks, Simon. I mean, that was such a beautiful response. I feel that I have to say I'm eager to hear everyone's voices. So we'll continue
Thank you so much.
our exchange. But I really want to note how wonderful a response and rich that was. And these points will keep coming back. In particular, the third, I think, is super crucial and a very important response to the book. But more immediately on Dan's questions, I mean, I think that Craig, so what I would want to do in answering this question is rest most on Craig Calhoun's argument, and then, you know, sort of say, kind of take it or leave it. I mean, so these contributions did both begin as talks somewhere, but they're not in response to each other. But I see it very much as a dialogue, and that was our thinking. I mean, that just as if this is interesting or helpful to situate this, and also because you raised the question of Roger Scruton being a contributor to this volume at all, and sort of how could that be? It was certainly a big surprise to a number of our other contributors. I can report, and I'm smiling as I say that, but I think it's a very serious point. I mean, we may be right or we may be wrong, but definitely in terms of our role as curators of the conversation in the volume, this particular exchange, as we see it, between Scruton and Calhoun, is one important aspect of the book. So I'm sort of happy to put a highlight on that, and everything that I would say now isn't so much what Michael Weinman thinks, although my thinking of it is shaped in part by this conversation that we curated, but just to say that this is the conversation that happens in the volume. And yes, so Scruton makes that argument. One thing I would stress, I mean, I'm not maybe it's clear by now, but it's not like I'm in profound sympathy with Scruton's view. That's probably clear by now. But I think one point that he stresses that I find to be rather compelling, as in, you know, from him, I mean, it's a contribution of armchair sociology, so take it or leave it as you wish. But I think it is in fact corroborated by work in political and cultural sociology, which is that there is a deficit relative to the post-war period in the English-speaking democracies when it comes to whatever you want to call that, civic identity or something. And this thing that we hear politicians, practicing politicians say a lot, I mean, it came up at the end of the vice presidential debate, the other night that, you know, people, I don't know, when I was growing up in the 1980s in New York, in a family that was very much out of sync with the Reagan Revolution, but in a neighborhood that was very much in favor of it, I would still say that actually there was, and I don't think it's mythologizing or romanticizing, and this is an empirical question, then that would need to be validated. And here I'm saying what Calhoun, I think, you know, is trying to say in this piece, that, yeah, there is. I mean, if you you sort of take this long view, we have a tension between political liberalism and, you know, nationalism that is a huge issue from modern democracies, because modern democracies associate them with the unit of the nation state on the one hand, and have understood themselves as constitutional republics. Mike Lee, right, recently pointed out that this is a, you know, sorry, but you know that, I mean, that this is a hard fit, actually. I mean, we can easily take it for granted, liberal democracy, that's what democracy looks like or should look like or something, but it's a hard fit, I guess is the point. And yes, so scrutiny in general, I think that serious questions can be raised along the lines that you ask, but in fact, there is a diminishment, and that diminishment would be visible in, for instance, Brexit, which is for sure, I think, on this reading, putting together, you know, the views into the view of the volume, if I can for a second. Yeah, that's definitely a manifestation of this, of illiberal democracy. That doesn't mean that everyone who voted for Brexit in any way understands themselves as advocating ideologically for something called illiberal democracy at all, right? There are all kinds of subject positions that would lead you to vote in favor of Brexit. But what it is an expression of the reality of the underlying, I think, okay, the volume thinks, cultural as well as socioeconomic sources of, yeah, deep frustration with so-called liberal democracy.
Thank you. The queue is open. I just want to remind you, you can raise your hand if you wish to ask any questions, and I'll be able to unmute you, or you can unmute yourself as well. Okay. I may not see all the hands if they are raised.
Bill was raising his hand on video online.
Okay. Okay, I have Bill, but I have Rebecca Spank who offers. So then we'll have Bill Sherman. Rebecca.
Thank you, Aurelian. I'm glad I could come to this. So when I was reading the introduction to your volume, Michael, I was also doing the reading for a meeting that Victorian Studies is having this afternoon. Yeah. And in the readings for the Victorian Studies meeting, which come out of a soon-to-be published issue of Victorian Studies and Critical Race Theory, liberal is clearly marked as a bad thing. Mm-hmm. And there are scholars within the academy calling loudly for the development of illiberal humanism. And advocating a whole host of illiberal attitudes toward knowledge. I don't know what to make of this, but it seems to me that the attack on liberalism is from both ends of the political spectrum, and it's also about the hollowing out of a belief that liberalism could deliver what it seemed to its proponents to promise throughout the 19th and much of the 20th century. And so I'm wondering how one maybe reaches that population or thinks about that critique in combination with the things that you study in this volume.
Michael? Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, I think, so one of the main thank you very much for the question. I mean, it's an important one and one that's on our mind a lot at the institution that this volume came from. You know, so as at a liberal arts colleague, what is the liberal? So in other words, let me take the question in this way, right? What is the liberal and liberal arts mean? What is that term doing there? And what does it mean to speak about a liberal arts education or a liberal education? Are they the same? And our students, those who self-selected to show up at a college that builds itself that way, express these very critiques, right, of liberalism often and in a very serious and substantial way. So I hope my response doesn't sound glib. There are good reasons to be disquieted by the tradition of liberalism. Its universalism can be appealing, I think, has a fundamental appeal. At the same time, that universalism was always at best imperfectly articulated or understood by its proponents. And often, you know, and that's putting it mildly and generously, and we can put it less mildly and less generously for sure. I mean, maybe that would be my version, but you could say they're hypocrites, those great proponents of the liberal tradition. So I think that it's very important I mean, this in a sense gets to the third of Simon's set of questions. You know, if we are, for those who hear themselves called to by that idea of, you know, sort of offering a normative defense of liberalism as an ideology, recognizing it as an ideological position and defending it as such, which is what I personally view as required, then definitely you need to have good arguments that will appeal both to those who are traditionally to the right of what liberalism has meant as a political ideology and to those who are to the left of what liberalism means as a political ideology, at least today. So the volume doesn't say a lot about that, as it turns out. I mean, that was a lot of our inspiration in having the conference and thinking it through. And then, gosh, I mean, a couple of years go by and the contributions all came in, and it turned out to be much more a work in contemporary and comparative politics. And I think that's great. I mean, I learned so much through the volume, but it's true, the volume never came around to kind of offer too much on that. So I sort of, I say back to the question how good and important a question it is, and to say that I think that those who work in you know, the humanistic social sciences, which I take this conversation to be happening in, and in the humanities, have a real burden, those of us who are in democratic societies, to think these things through and to articulate something that speaks to people from where they are in their current political and cultural configurations. And I guess, I mean, I have some things that I have some thoughts about all that, but they're frankly not, you know, in the volume, and then that's work to still be done. But I think that it's very important, and maybe it is worth just saying that I do think it needs to be done, actually. I think that the liberal tradition, as problematic as it is, does need to be defended.
Thank you, Michael. Bill?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Michael. It sounds, I didn't have a chance to read the introduction. It sounds like a fascinating volume. I think Simon did a very nice job talking about all the different things we could talk about. And, you know, my question, it's a very selfish one. So there's so much stuff being published on this topic right now. So if you could sort of summarize, what do you think the main analytic accomplishment of this volume is? Perhaps there isn't really one. Perhaps it's an interesting, messy volume, you know, and that's fine. But I guess I'm still having a hard time figuring out what, you know, what that main contribution would be. You had a lot of interesting things to say. And again, you know, Zoom is not always useful. It isn't, for me, I've discovered in terms of learning, in terms of listening, right? But it sounded as though the volume works with the premise that this category, illiberal democracy, is somehow a useful starting point, right? I mean, is that, maybe this is just a misunderstanding, because as you know, there's all these different candidates out there. These are not just semantic distinctions, right? Populism, authoritarianism, post-fascism, Caesarism, I mean, so I'd be curious, you know, why that framework of illiberal democracy? My sense is, even though Jeff wrote a very powerful defense of that term, my sense is the debate has kind of moved beyond that a little bit. I mean, that notion comes from Fareed Zakaria. It's a kind of conservative reading of Tocqueville. It misses the way in which these movements are deeply undemocratic and so on, right? So, but maybe this is just a misunderstanding of what you're doing.
Yeah, maybe I could, thanks, Bill. So this is, I mean, this is closer to my, I don't know, it's always, I don't know, how do you introduce a volume in 20 minutes? And I'm, if anything, a political theorist when it comes, you know, or that's the closest I am to sort of the fields that this volume touches on. So this gets closest to what my, you know, contribution is. So what I was trying to say two things at once at the beginning, and I was probably, it was a bit confused in my presentation. The volume comes from a conference, and the conference was a response to illiberal democracy as a term, and the volume tries to move away from that, which is why the volume is called The Emergence of Illiberalism. But what I would strongly defend personally, although contributors to the volume have their disagreements about this, is that illiberalism as an ideological formation has an internal coherence, and an analytic clarity. So I mean, the different usages of the term, as well as the use of the term both conceptually and empirically, cohere and are consistent, and, you know, have applicability in the world. So like that's, in other words, there's a lot going for the term illiberalism. And I think that a lot of, so that I would still say that. I don't think personally, and then contributors to the volume might disagree, that there, you know, I think that the deployment of the term, you know, when Orban says our version of democracy, which he sometimes calls a Christian democracy and sometimes calls illiberal democracy, has such and such characteristics. I don't think that's, I think that requires attention and response, but I don't think that's the thing that the volume is about. What I do think the volume is about illiberalism as a coherent ideological formation, independently from the questions of, you know, autocratization and Caesarism and, you know, other sort of institutional arguments within comparative politics, that these things intersect and those analyses are important too, but it is important to investigate illiberalism as a highly successful ideological formation. I guess that's the consensus view, I think, of the volume among disagreements.
So can I follow up? I mean, I'll have to read it because I'm just very skeptical of that, right?
Okay.
So, liberalism obviously is a highly contested term. It's meant lots of different things historically. It means lots of different things today. Illiberalism, you're going to have a similar thing going on, right? So, you know, socialism is illiberal. If you think, as many do, right, that, you know, private property has something to do with liberalism. So is an attack on the rule. I mean, so it seems to me there's so many different features that could fall under the rubric of illiberalism. I don't know. So if the term is meant, so I'm just trying to figure out, so that, is the term meant to be a descriptive one in terms of capturing these movements and these systems in power? And then it just seems to me that illiberalism is just not going to get you very far. Well, it'll help you with something, certainly, right? I mean, it makes sense to call Orban illiberal in some ways. But I would, you know, the advantage I would say, so I'm just curious,
Right.
If some of the writers in your chapter push towards other categorizations, because my sense of some of the possible advantages of those other categorizations is they offer a somewhat more nuanced framework.
So completely granted, an important point. Like I said, that there's a consensus that there is something like illiberalism, and I think that's true among them. I'm trying to go through the list of contributors in my head and to see, but like for instance, here's one good example of a place where this tension is obvious in the volume, and a chapter that might be especially interesting then for you would be chapter 7. Hopkin and Bod's chapter on anti-system politics, right? Like in a world that, you know, that our curatorial duties would have supervened, that chapter would have been called, you know, illiberal anti-system politics, a comparative study, you know? So there's a case where anti-system seems like the right descriptor and not illiberal to the chapter authors in a way that that displays a kind of discomfort with this. So then maybe I would just say, speaking for ourselves as editor, you know, so Boris and myself as editors, then yeah, the reason that chapter belongs in the emergence of illiberalism, because from our view, what that chapter demonstrates, and that's probably the most empirical comparative politics article, you know, with graphs and charts and things that we have, you know, we see that as describing part of the manifestation of the emergence of illiberalism, which we take to be, and we don't take it to be, we don't presuppose, we take the evidence to have shown to be, yes, an empirical phenomenon as something consistent, something that has enough internal consistency to be a thing that deserves to be named as that thing and not other things. So yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Also other things are always happening, you know, so Erdogan's Turkey and the fact that we can sort of name polities that way show that there are other things always happening, but that among the things that are happening, there's this attack on liberal institutions that had developed in these polities that are being attacked qua liberal institutions in the name of democracy.
So some of these liberal regimes are following, you know, pro-market policies, right? So it's complicated.
It's complicated.
Okay, we have,
messy.
Thank you both. Next in line is Haas, Professor Haas Banai. Thank you.
Thank you, Aurelian. Thank you, Michael, for sharing this volume, and congratulations on publishing it. I guess my question piggybacks on Bill's question. I'm a little uneasy about the kind of the absence of any talk about power. You rarely mentioned that word. I mean, one kind of narrative, I think we're in this moment where we're trying to kind of figure out what the dominant narrative about the fate of liberalism is, right? There seems to be this general consensus that liberal is in trouble, but this whole bunch of unique cases, oftentimes bunched together. I'm gonna use the case of Turkey right now. I think it's difficult to make those kind of comparisons with the established liberal states in which, to me, it seems like there's a fundamental battle over power going on, right? On the right and on the left, you have basically pre-established prescriptions in search of a diagnostic, right? And liberalism is always a potent diagnostic for both the progressive left and the reactionary right, right? Because liberals are the ones who are, you know, in search of an equilibrium, and thereby they always have their hands dirty in whatever status quo that is in power. But I like the normative point that you bring up, in that perhaps a restatement in favor of liberal democracy is something that could be clarifying in this moment, because it would give us an understanding of why the struggle for power on the other two spectrums is corrosive to democracy, why it is undermining the normative projects of those who wish to regard their fellow citizens as having worth and respect and value to discourse with, even if we completely disagree with, right? If I take your point about Roger Scruton, is that he is participating in that spirit. There is this kind of conversation about, you know, equal respect for persons. That's a fundamental, you know, liberal value that is being recognized increasingly, that is being undermined. But I think by kind of trying to juxtapose this as a kind of an illiberal, a rise of illiberalism, these projects that are fundamentally are about the preservation of a particular order or power, we are overlooking something far more fundamental than a you know, theoretical normative opposition to liberalism, which is a very big tent that includes within itself many different branches that struggle to define what those particular liberal principles mean at any given time. It's highly contextualized, and oftentimes can only be named retrospectively. Ah, so-and-so was liberal compared to so-and-so. And that debate is still, I mean, I know Rebecca's work touches on this. Many people who work in, you know, post-Enlightenment liberal democracy are still trying to define who's a liberal and who's not. So what say you about power? How does power figure in this? And are we basically talking about this struggle that's ultimately about power and not ideas?
Thank you, Hans. Michael?
Yeah. So I guess I would say, so I think that some of, and you know, so I think the volume as a whole, I've come to understand since its publication, certainly sees the emergence of illiberalism as a function of political economy, for sure. That's become apparent to me, which wasn't, this is like my first response to power. So like, why is power so absent or something like that? It sort of takes me, it gives me pause because, because I see my interest in this as emerging from, on the one hand, as fundamentally about debates that we have about hard and soft power. But I recognize that it's not a discourse that the volume, as it's come to exist, announces itself as participating in. But I see that as integral to the third set of questions that Simon raised, and definitely as, for me, very interesting for the intersection, now thinking about liberalism in the first place, of liberalism as an ideology within international politics after the Second World War, and liberalism as a tradition of thought going back to the 17th century, 16th century, maybe. So there I see the fundamental tension to be exactly that. Liberalism on the one hand has been about this liberal world order, and then the preservation of power-bearing institutions through the transitions that the book talks about. So not about the intellectual tradition, which is where I come from, and questions that I think about in terms of the cultural dimension that we spoke about earlier, but this, realpolitik side of liberalism. And these illiberal formations that have had such success, clearly what makes them interesting for anyone who isn't an adherent to them is the fact that they've had tremendous success within their polities. So I think that that's the background of interest in them. The analysis that the chapter authors provide about the specific illiberal polities that we discuss tend to emphasize, on the one hand, the socioeconomic background, so the hollowing out of the welfare state and the impoverishment, and what that's meant for the electoral success of these parties that identify themselves with illiberal ideologies on the one hand, and on the other hand, the cultural dimension. So for instance, the case that we haven't spoken about, I haven't said anything about so far in Brazil, where you have on the one hand Bolsonaro's identification of the liberal elites as out of touch in ways that are recognizable, and on the other hand, his alignment with evangelical Christianity. So there are those two pillars. I see power politics personally as hugely integral to the global phenomenon, and that manifests itself in that second pillar, which is institutional. And I take it as a valid point that the volume as a whole could have done more. And if it falls to me to make the case more clearly, then that second pillar, the institutional pillar, I think the account of power needs to be more explicit. But that it's there, it's there in the analysis, it's waiting to be said, and it needs to be said, I guess is what I would say.
Thank you, Michael. Kwang Yu, you had your hand raised. Are you still interested in asking a question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
This is also a follow-up question from Professor Schulman. So this term like illiberalism can be very broad, like maybe this volume cannot cover every strand of that thought, right? So my question would be that, like, I think a very interesting section in the introduction chapter is that you say that liberalism is not only a reactionary power. It's not. It has also like produced many positive projects. But at the same time, I see that the productive things you mentioned are like almost all very negative in fact. So, but at the same time, like beyond the spectrum of liberalism, I think like the ideologies of conservatism and socialism, radical left socialism, by themselves that are very systematic and self-coherent. Do you think these forces are the subject of your volume, or maybe not? Do you think they can be regarded as like systematic alternative to the liberal system, or you still want to say that liberalism can broadly include those quite right and left things and contain them together, right?
Michael?
Yeah, right. So illiberalism is not just a reaction, I think is a really crucial insight of the introduction, if there is any. I hope, yeah, so that to me is maybe the central thing that I think merits being said, and I hadn't said that. So thank you for reminding me of that part of the introduction. It's not, so liberalism has productive capacities in our view. I think that that's true. It doesn't merely summon up rage at the excesses of what gets called neoliberalism, a term that I managed to avoid using until now, but I'll gesture to that way. Yeah, so oftentimes you'll hear said something that seems to me like wishful thinking from left of center people within more or less the mainstream of political ideological formations across the liberal democratic world, that whatever the name, this new populism and or illiberalism or the growing autocracy or the Caesarism is simply, right, a reaction to neoliberalism. And so it's important, and that exists. I mean, the reaction against neoliberalism is real, and it has a lot to do with Brexit, and it has a lot to do with the election of Donald Trump, and it has a lot to do with the success of illiberal politicians in the emerging democracies of Central and Eastern Europe and elsewhere. So it's like definitely a relevant item for discussion, but it's not the whole story, and it's not the main driving force of the story, is our view. That doesn't mean that there's some single consistent thing to be offered as an alternative, and that's, I guess, what we try to argue you see when the forces of illiberalism are in power, in fact. That there isn't some consistent set of deliverables that they can provide and be measured against. So it's an ambivalent, I hope not ambiguous, but an ambivalent sort of condition. On the one hand, the forces of illiberalism, as they seek power and as they exercise power, are advocating for something that has content. It's not merely a voice of reaction. On the other hand, there isn't a consistent set of deliverables. And so in democratic polities where government needs to be responsive, then the question is, what's the reaction to the reaction? And what we see in the US right now is in the presidential race, a kind of return to normalcy or order, which of course in the analysis that we provide and many others, and it's perfectly clear to everyone, I think, who's sensible and sensitive to these things is not going to address what brought liberal polities to this point in the first place. So yeah, no, I mean, liberalism as we knew it doesn't have that either. And so, it's not a prognosticative book, but the prognostication would not be very positive, I think, on the basis of that analysis of illiberalism's productive capacities.
Thank you. Dan, your hand is up. I'm not sure whether I forgot to lower it, or you have a follow-up question?
I do not. Well, I have other questions, but I'm happy for other people to get in the queue. So
there's no one I have here, so you better go. I just want to remind you that we aim on going not further than 1:15-ish. The 75 minutes is the rule on Zoom. Usually we go for 1 hour and a half, but if there are questions, we will go a few more minutes. So Dan, would you like to follow up?
Yeah, so this actually relates to the essay that Aurelian and I published in 2019, I guess it was, on why liberalism is constantly said to be dying or failing. Liberalism's always been under attack since its birth, whenever that was, and there are different stories about that. And, you know, it's always being argued that, well, now liberalism has to defend itself, but then it always has. We had Popper then, we've got Steve Pinker now providing a great deal of evidence of the wonders worked by liberal polities and societies over the last half century. And some even take it as a work that actually defends neoliberalism. I'm agnostic on that point. And yet these pretenders, or these would-be replacements for liberalism, seemingly never have to defend themselves. It's only the liberalism that has to defend it, and we're going to compare real existing liberalism with all of its flaws to our ideal system, which does not have to be defended. And so I'm wondering why, you know, how do we respond to that as liberals?
Can I add one thing to the article that we published in 2018, I think, Dan? It's an interesting fact of 20th century history that liberalism actually has won against the two anti-liberal movements, fascism and communism. Liberalism came out victoriously in the 20th century. So I echo the same, not puzzlement, but the same concern that Dan has expressed. Michael?
Yeah, I think that that's a fair point from our perspective as volume contributors. I think that maybe this isn't a normative argument, but a descriptive one about how we find ourselves. I mean, the people who it fell to bring the book into existence, that it's our perception that in our circles of discourse, in the way that Rebecca pointed to earlier in our conversation, I mean, liberalism is a dirty word, or however you want to put it, and that seems striking, given where we're placed in society. And so within that, I mean, that doesn't, of course, justify, but it might somewhat explain why this intervention seemed worthwhile. I think that if I take a step back, I think, and this will be more of a cultural argument, I think that we are in a somewhat unique moment in the constant crisis of the eternal crisis of liberalism, which I take the point. Liberals always feel called upon to defend liberalism and that it's in crisis. And that's a sign of its, I think I would say, as a normative claim, that's a sign of its maturity as an outlook on life, that in fact, I mean, any kind of ideological formation should always be in crisis in the sense of always having to legitimate itself. So that's, I don't see that as unhealthy or something like that, but I do think there's a particular form of unhealthiness in the current moment when it comes to the difficulty of staging a conversation among people who are broadly speaking liberals, who have different left-right orientations, and the naturalness of that being difficult or impossible or not worthwhile. So I suppose that's what I would say about this particular volume, at least, as a kind of articulation or act of guardianship toward liberalism, that it seems worthwhile to continue staging conversations where folks who are more or less find themselves spoken to by the liberal tradition try to articulate what the liberal tradition means or looks like, or why it's having difficulties of legitimation from within their own subject positions from across the political left and right, as that those are defined within more or less liberal democracies. That seems like a valuable act, and that would be the rationale for the volume.
I think it's more than a valuable act, it's a timely one. We have time for one final question if anyone wants to ask. Our time is approaching the end of our assigned slot here. I just want to add one comment, as if there may be other questions coming up, Michael. Liberalism is based on a very ambitious wager. It's predicated upon several pillars. One is that power must be checked. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, but any power, has to be checked through a series of mechanisms, separation, balance of powers, and so forth. Then there's an emphasis on pluralism. So liberals are committed to the idea that progress is possible through fostering diversity and pluralism of ideas. And that doesn't exclude tensions and contradictions, but it does assume that pluralism is good. And then there is a third pillar, which would be the belief in reason, facts, step-by-step checking of the legitimacy of the various claims, and the opposition to an overarching narrative. Rebecca asked earlier about the critical race theory, and she was wondering how that sits with liberalism. I see that as an illiberal doctrine, because it sees everything through the prism of power and race and ideology. And it seeks to simplify what is otherwise a messy, complex, plural, diverse, and ultimately contradictory reality. And the best we can do as liberals, so to speak, is to create a decent balance, an equipoise, always fragile, equilibrium. The sort that Isaiah Berlin mentioned by us in the chat room, that is the best we could do. It's better than killing each other. It's not perfect, but liberalism means progress. And those who deny that, I think, are fundamentally illiberal. We are better off today than we were 200 years ago in America, in Europe, around the world. We're better today. We will be better 20 years from now than we are today. So I think this needs to be said in any, not defense of liberalism, but any discussion. I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that, or anyone else, as we reach our final point. But it seems to me that these are important topics, and we should discuss them with an awareness of the complexity. And I think your book and contributors, I haven't read the chapter by Scruton, but I'm pleased that you included a voice that actually brings some contradictions, maybe tensions in the arguments that others present, and make the discussion messier, but perhaps more interesting.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that I do think that it's difficult. I mean, I guess so I speak my own subject position with respect to articulating a situated and power sensitive, a normative defense of liberalism, which is among others one of the goals of the volume. Then it's important, it seems to me, both to call attention to actually existing liberalism's excesses and faults, which are perhaps overemphasized at times and underemphasized at other times, and to acknowledge the messiness of the world in which it remains the best, it seems to me in my analysis, as far as I can judge until now, that the best possibility for providing some sort of decent basis for common life. So that would be the way that I would say it. And the volume tries, by understanding the immediate challenges to liberalism in terms of broader ongoing tensions within liberalism, to do both. I mean, to say that illiberal practices and politicians have success for some reasons, and that points to ways that reform is possible.
But there's a line. This reminds me. There's a line that is attributed to Mahatma Gandhi. He was once asked, "What do you think of the Western civilization?" And he paused for a moment and he said, "It will be a good idea."
Yeah.
And I think that in conclusion to your talk, if someone asks, "What do you think of liberalism?" I think we can all say it will be a great idea. And I think that it is that idea that we should cherish, the avoidance of cruelty and violence and incremental progress. And I think that's why it's important. I'd like to thank all of you for being with us this afternoon. This was a talk sponsored by the Tocqueville program, the Political Theory Luncheon in Political Science, and the Ostrom Workshop. We will have a series of events coming up in October and November. The next event will be on October 23rd, 2 weeks from now. And it will be a talk given by Dr. Konstantin Vassiliou from the Kinder Institute at the University of Missouri. He'll be talking about Montesquieu and the Enlightenment. The talk will be at 3 p.m. rather than usual 12 o'clock. I will be sending the reminders in due course. Please mark your calendars. And then on October 30th, we'll start a series called The Idea of America, and we will have a talk by Bradford Wilson from Princeton University on Alexander Hamilton. Without further ado, I'd like to thank Michael and Simon for 2 excellent presentations. Thank you to all of you for being with us. It's always a pleasure to see so many faces, welcoming the new ones. Has, do you have a point? Your hand is up. Okay, just a round of applause to our distinguished friends. Thank you to all, and be safe and enjoy this beautiful day. See you soon.